Good evening.
Good evening.
Oh, that was great. I did 10. And I didn't say good morning. That was what I was worried I would do. And I'm sorry, I have to get this a little better so I can see my nose. I'll leave it there. So we're here. I'm so glad that you're here tonight. I want to welcome you on behalf of our faith community here at First Church in Wenham. And I wanted to thank the missions board of our church who did a lot of work putting this event together. And hopefully this is the beginning of many more conversations like this about issues of human rights in our local community. So before we get started, I have a few things to tell you, little housekeeping things. If you're not familiar with the church building, the restrooms are through this door to the left. If you don't want anyone to know where you're going, you can go down the back stairs, walk all the way underneath, and come up these stairs, and no one will ever know. My suggestion to you really is, no one will want to walk up there. I'm sorry.
There are signs if you want to go through that.
Yes, there are signs if you want to go. There's also a restroom downstairs. And then I also want to mention that there's no break in the program, so I think this is helpful to know. If you need a break, feel free to take a break, get up, walk, stretch your legs. But just don't interrupt the program going on, that's all. And of course, silence your phone if you have one that's on. And I want to thank you all for wearing face masks. We appreciate that, and protecting you and protecting the rest of us. Appreciate that. So I'm going to introduce now Cecilia Mullings. She's a member of the mission board here.
Good evening. I thought I'd just start us off with a poem. And I tried to choose something that was not too dense, but fitting, and I found this beautiful poem by Robert William Service. It's called Home and Love. Just home and love. The words are small, 4 little letters unto each, and yet you will not find in all the wide and gracious range of speech 2 more so tenderly complete. When angels talk in heaven above, I'm sure they have no words more sweet than home and love. Just home and love. It's hard to guess which of the 2 were best to gain. Home without love is bitterness. Love without home is often pain. No, each alone will seldom do. Somehow they travel hand in glove. If you win one, you must have 2, both home and love. And if you've both, well then I'm sure you ought to sing the whole day long. It doesn't matter if you're poor. With these 2, make divine your song. And so I praisefully repeat, when angels talk in heaven above, there are no words more simply sweet than home and love.
Thank you, Cecilia. That's lovely. Like you, I am looking forward to hearing from our guest speakers today. But before we get there, I want to tell you just a little bit about what to expect. I'll be asking questions of our panelists. They'll have time to answer the question. And then before we go to the next question, you'll have an opportunity to ask one of the panelists a question, or just ask the whole panel a question. And between the questions, there's that sort of repeats, but there'll be some music. It would be lovely to have in between that. So I will introduce the panel by name and organization, and then you each have a few minutes to say who you are. Okay, so we have on the far end is Megan O'Neill from the Essex County Dutch Catholic Community. Then Rachel Hand comes next from Family Promise of the North Shore. And Anna Caesar from the Hamilton Wenham Human Rights Coalition. So, go ahead.
Hi, everybody.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Remember, you still have my mic.
My name is Megan. I'm with Habitat for Humanity, and I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that most of you know the work that Habitat does. We focus on affordable home ownership. And one very exciting project that we got approved yesterday is 10 homes on Asbury Street in Hamilton. So, coming to a neighborhood near you. And we just finished 2 homes in Wenham as well.
Hello, I'm Rachel Hand, and I'm the Executive Director of Family Promise North Shore, Boston. We are a local homeless services agency. We serve families that are experiencing or at risk of homelessness in Essex County and some of the surrounding communities. So we primarily provide emergency shelter, but we do homelessness prevention and shelter diversion, which means families come to us at risk of losing their housing or maybe on shelter's doorstep, and we try to keep them safe, keep them housed, but in worst case scenarios, we can bring them into shelter as well.
Great, thank you. And I am Anna Cizik. I am the president of the Hamilton Wenham Human Rights Coalition. We are a 501c4 nonprofit founded last year, and our focus is on hyperlocal education, conversation, and building allyship within our very small community of Hamilton and Wenham. We've had a number of programs throughout the last year, partially funded. I'd like to give public credit to the First Church of Wenham, who's provided funding through the Missions Board and also the grants, primary grants group. So I want to say thank you while I have a chance to do that. Last year was a really big year for us. We started a number of speaker series, and our really big event that we plan to build on was the first ever Pride event here at Hamilton Wenham, which was the Pride picnic that had over 400 people come together. So we're all about local activism around human rights. And I personally live here in Hamilton. I live less than a mile up Arbor Street. I might walk home after this. So I am really excited to be here tonight as a member of this community talking about an issue that is really, really important to me and important to us.
Okay, thank you. So here's the first question. It's the big question. What is the cause of housing insecurity in our area? So anything wants to say?
It's a big one to start out with, yes. So I think there's a number of different causes, but I don't want to take all the answers away. So I'm kind of just going to talk about 2 of them. One of the primary drivers has been really the way the cost of housing in our region has risen much faster than wages. So over the past 20 years, if you looked at the ratio of average household income to the price of a home, 20 years ago, it was 4 times the average income, which is considered unaffordable. It should be about 3 times is sort of the national average. So 20 years ago, we were already more expensive, and today it's 5.3 times the cost of the average family's income. It's no better on the rental side. On the rental side, rents have gone from 28% of household income to 38% of household income. What's considered affordable is 30% of your household income going towards your rent costs. So families are absolutely priced out of the market at every step and every level here. And you see it from young families looking to buy homes in the area, to renters looking for a safe place to be able to call home temporarily. The price has been a huge driver. The thing that I think is driving that is our really restrictive zoning and permitting process. So when you look at 2-acre single-family zoning, which is lovely, and I live in Ipswich, so believe me that you couldn't build the house that I live in today in Ipswich. I own a 2-family, my husband and I own a 2-family house on a 1/2-acre lot. We're a 1/2 mile from downtown and the train station. Today, our neighborhood is 2-acre single-family zoning. Our house, I would say, which has been there for 150 years, is probably not detracting from the neighborhood, is probably not the cause of all the traffic in town. I would say that we really need to think about our zoning and who we are allowing to build. So when you look at in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, about 30,000 permits were issued across Massachusetts to build homes each year. In the 90s, noughts, and teens, tens, for the past 2 decades, it's been half that. We're building 15,000. We're issuing 15,000 building permits a year. And previously, many of those were multifamily, and today, the number of those that are single family has increased dramatically. So we're building about half the number of buildings that we used to, and more of those are single family in 2-acre zoning. We've got to change our zoning process locally, communities like this, and we've got to change the permitting process. I think those are 2 big drivers.
I agree. I do agree. I think Massachusetts, a couple of numbers that I always like to share to kind of reinforce what Megan is saying. Massachusetts is the 3rd worst state in the country when it comes to expense versus wage. So that means living expense, and in this particular case, the housing expense, right? So we are 3rd to Hawaii and California. So just keep that in mind. The other thing in Massachusetts is we have one of the higher minimum wage in the country, but it is not enough to support the housing. I'm actually going to take my mask off. The mask is very not breathable right now. So Massachusetts, our minimum wage does not pay for the housing in the area. Another statistic or number that I like to share with people is the living wage in Essex County right now. Over the course of the pandemic, it actually increased about $20,000 for at least the demographic that I typically use as an example. So if you're a single parent with 2 children in Essex County, the living wage is $100,000 a year. But minimum wage, as we know, if you're lucky, you're making $15 an hour, but in Massachusetts, it's not even up to that yet. You're barely making $30,000 a year. And so when you look at how much housing costs in this area, as Megan was talking about, in order to avoid homelessness and the risk of homelessness, you really should only be paying about 30% of your income towards housing. And that's just not happening in Massachusetts. So there's a lack of affordable housing. There's just a lack of housing, which makes all housing more expensive, right? And because of these zoning laws in particular, it's really important to kind of focus on that. And then the other thing that I like to talk about too is when it comes to homelessness, what's the difference between someone who ends up experiencing homelessness because they can't afford housing and someone who doesn't? And there's a middle period too where there are people who don't have the same support systems and support networks that some of us do. Right now, what we're seeing when we're getting calls from families who are at risk of homelessness is many of these families are doubled up with relatives that are on a subsidy, or they're doubled up with friends who are already staying with friends. And so their situations are more precarious because there's just no housing available, and the housing that they're able to stay in is not stable in and of itself. You know, if I were to become homeless, if I were to lose my housing for any which reason, I have relatives, I have friends with whole houses, spare bedrooms that can take me in, and that's just not the case right now in Massachusetts for many of the families and individuals that we're seeing who are at risk of experiencing homelessness. So I would say in addition to what Megan has said, the living wage in our area is very, very high and no one is making that. There's a lack of housing entirely for the reasons that she mentioned. And then the people that are at risk of losing this housing don't have any support networks of people and their families, generational poverty. There is an intersection of racism and all of this stuff that we're seeing right now where these generationally poor families are continuing to be poor and they don't have people they can turn to when they end up in these situations without housing.
I'd just like to note for the record that having to go behind both of you puts me at a disadvantage every time. I'm joked. So of course I agree the market forces are obvious, and that's simple economics. The supply is down, the demand is up, the prices are going up. So we see this even in, the non-affordable sector. How many of you have seen your Zillow prices creep up? Some people are saying, well, it's a great time to buy, it's a great time to sell. But if I were to try to sell my house in Hamilton, I can't even afford to buy something similar somewhere else. So what's happening at a high level is worse and exacerbated at the lower income levels. So that's part of it. I think the idea of houses and families being overextended is really serious coming out of the pandemic. And the idea that there are many families, even moderate income families, that are 1 or 2 paychecks away from losing their home or having to take out a second mortgage or maybe take out a credit card, and all of that spirals down to the bottom. So I think that one of the things that I see as a cause of insecurity is just general market instability. And a lot of it's driven by the larger forces that Megan and Rachel talked about. The one that I want to talk about is why is there so little supply? And obviously zoning is a part of it. I think we'll talk about that later. But I think the thing that I notice a lot in our community is this underlying resistance to new housing. And it's almost like small towns are frozen in time, and they like it that way. These are the streets that are here. We don't want to put a new house there. We can't build there because of the water or the traffic or the noise. All these children are going to make so much noise, as if that's a bad thing. I think, don't you want to hear that? So one of the things that I really think is part of the problem of limiting supply is overcoming that stigma that we can't change or build new housing. And so if the supply is down, the demand is up, it's going to increase the market. And as part of that, as Rachel is saying, you can't really ignore the legacy of classism and racism in these communities, which are disproportionately white, disproportionately wealthy. And we start talking about building new housing, it's very interesting to see the conversation shift of, well, housing for who? Who's going to come live here? And all of a sudden it changes because the idea of building senior housing for people who, quote, always lived here implies people that are white, because these communities are 97% white. So you sort of have to overcome, why do you have to have always lived here? Doesn't everybody need housing? What is it that is this sort of nativist tendency in us? And so I think that, in a very subtle, sometimes, and also not so subtle way, influences policy about who we're building housing for, what are the forces that converge, so that when new housing is proposed, then all of a sudden we start to qualify it. Well, is it multifamily? Is it going to be low-income housing or transitional housing? And one of the things that I've always found really troubling about conversations in housing is that we associate the value of someone in our community with how much money they make. And I think it's a really dangerous tendency to think that someone is more or less worthy of housing based on their income. Because point in fact, I qualify for affordable housing based on what I make. To look at me, you'd never think that, but that's the reality. The town clerk qualifies for affordable housing based on her salary. All of these municipal employees, early teachers. I remember my daughter's kindergarten teacher was talking about wanting to buy a house in Hamilton or Wenham. She couldn't afford it here. This was the kindergarten teacher that we were bringing in to teach our kids, couldn't afford to live here. So I think at some level we have to look at what is the supply doing and who is it excluding and why is it excluding those people? And all of that for me boils together to why housing insecurity is a problem.
All right, so you got us started. So how about anybody out there, do you have a question about what you just heard? Something you want to, or a comment that you want to lift up? If you do, raise your hand or just stand right up. Don't be shy. Go ahead. Can you stand up?
Well, I just wondered, other towns, like Ipswich or places nearby, all about, do they have what you are, human rights person? That would be interesting to see if surrounding areas are getting on board.
Yeah, sure, that's a great question, and very timely. So what's interesting is last year, when we formed as a nonprofit, that was sort of big, exciting news. One of the other things that we did is we advocated and successfully lobbied both of the two towns of Hamilton and Wenham to create municipal human rights commissions, which is really exciting and a great feather in the cap, actually, the two towns, because it opens up other possibilities for grant funding, for state funding, if you can have a municipal body. So Hamilton and Wenham are doing well, but it's an interesting question because as soon as that started happening, and it was especially driven by the Pride Picnic, which was a really visible event, I got outreach from people in Ipswich, Topsfield, Manchester, Essex saying, how did you do that? Like, how did you make that happen? And we had a flag forum in association with the 2 town HRCs and the police chiefs, and one of the people in that call was actually from Danvers, bigger city, more involved. And that was the question of how do we make this happen here? Because it took a convergence of some political will and a lot of organized citizens. So I've actually had several conversations with people in Ipswich, Manchester, Essex, who are trying to do the same kind of work. And it's interesting because human rights issues you think of as this huge global, umbrella. We could be like Amnesty International. That would be difficult to run out of my living room, but we could try, So the question is, what's the benefit of a hyper-local human rights group? And we get asked that a lot, which is, I'm not so interested in working on international policy. I care deeply, but our work is not really going to affect what's going on overseas. We're looking for instances of human rights issues as they manifest right here. And to some degree, that is a little bit municipally based, because what happens in Hamilton Wenham is similar to Ipswich, but from a governance structure, they're not the same town, right? They have different boundaries, they have different school systems, they have different police departments. So a lot of issues that might fall into those categories do have a municipal track. And housing is not unlike that, because when the state looks at the subsidized housing inventory and looking at 40B, it's based on municipality. So that's one of those issues that does kind of have a town by town tie. But there are people working on it in all those communities, and if people are interested, I could happily introduce you to the other human rights advocates that are trying to do the same thing wherever they are.
Thank you. Yes, go ahead. You can stand up when you.
Sure. Just to follow up, my name is Anna, and I have been in great communication. Myself and a number of other people in Ipswich have started the Ipswich Equity and Justice Coalition, where we definitely don't have the speed that Anna and her group has, but we are coming together, and I'm happy to speak to you afterwards and make your information. So we're just starting to come together now. We've been able to work with the town. They're on board, and so we're going to have a similar deal. We have a community group and a town group. So
Thank you. Are there any other questions about what's causing housing insecurity that was said? All right. I think we're going to be listening to some music now. so everybody gets a chance to be last. So I'll start with Rachel and go to Anna and then to me. So we just heard about causes of housing insecurity. So this question is about solutions. What are some solutions we can work toward to end housing insecurity in our communities? And then the second that goes with it is, what role does your organization play in working toward these solutions?
That was a real curveball, Judy. So I think, what I have written here is very simple. Educate, listen, and share. And I think that it sounds simple, but to actually execute it can be rather complicated. Solutions towards ending this situation that we have going on in Massachusetts it's really complex. It's systemic issues. It's issues that stem all the way up through our policies, years of legislation and zoning laws that it's really hard to kind of turn over. And I think what I often tell people, because it can feel pretty overwhelming when you're in this work, especially like with my staff, but even people who, like all of you who are here tonight, who clearly care deeply and want to make a difference. Sometimes change seems like it can take forever, and sometimes you push and push and push and nothing happens. So rather than get discouraged, what I tell people is the more you're willing to talk about what's happening, the more you know about what's happening. So therefore, when you do go to talk about it, you actually can speak confidently about the issues going on specifically in Massachusetts and in the North Shore. The more you talk about these things, the more other people's wheels start turning, the more they start to question, how is this happening? And then they start to research, and then they start to talk about it. And what it all basically comes down to is advocacy and policy change, right? And so I think what I like to do most through Family Promise is share stories, because what we are very privileged to experience as staff at Family Promise is we hear countless heartbreaking stories on a daily basis. I hear them through my staff. I hear them when I'm privileged enough to be the person answering the phones. Oftentimes the families that call us, we're not the first agency they've shared their whole life story to. They've probably talked to 3 or 4 other advocates at this point. Sometimes we're the call that they've made because the other advocates have not been able to help them. They're hitting a bunch of roadblocks, and the stories that we're hearing are of your neighbors. They're of people teaching your kids. Quite literally, we have had people call us who are in need of assistance, that are school teachers, that are child care providers, that are healthcare workers, and they're telling us these horrifying situations that they find themselves in, where they are just a moment's notice away from being homeless and not knowing what to do. With the pandemic, we've seen this happen to families that never thought they'd be in this situation before, and that's really scary, because I think a lot of times with generational poverty especially, people are kind of, prior to the pandemic, many of the people that we saw who were at risk of experiencing homelessness might have had a relative who'd gone through it, might have had in the back of their heads that this could have always been an option. What we're seeing right now is numbers of families and people who have never ever considered that they'd find themselves at risk of homelessness. And the reason people are becoming homeless, quite frankly, is because there's no homes. So what we need to do is hear these stories, ask about these stories, talk to people, and then start to share them. And if you know what can be changed, if you know what policies and things need to be turned over, who to vote for, city council is one of the most important things you could get involved in. And that's not just running for city council, that's voting in the city council election. So I hope everyone in this room voted recently, just this past week, because those types of things, that's what changes the zoning laws, and that's what makes it possible for us to have some real systemic change. And then the last thing I want to touch on is, don't blame the person, blame the system. One of the things to be part of the solution that at Family Promise we really try to focus on is really breaking down stigma. I think a lot of times when people talk about homelessness specifically, but people who are in these situations of poverty, they're very quick to say, oh, well, can you give them a budgeting class? And I always find that really comical, because telling someone to budget When their expenses are $1,000 and they have $500, well, if you took a really good budgeting class, and if you guys have any idea of where to find those classes, I can tell you how to basically like create wealth. That would be really helpful. But I think that a lot of times we turn to the individual, to the family, and we say, well, they must be the exception. They must have done something differently, or maybe there was a misstep. You know, I've had people say that maybe they shouldn't have coffee in the morning, or maybe they, and little things that's not changing the system, right? People shouldn't have to sacrifice their caffeine or whatever it may be to afford to live. And so I think really challenging yourself to blame the system and understand what the system is causing these inequities before jumping to the conclusion that it's on the person. So I don't want to keep talking around, wait to get everything from you guys.
I like that you. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay. I really break the stigma. It's like our minds melded there like that. So as a local advocacy group, obviously that's a huge part of what we're doing. So I would say as the Hamilton Wenham Human Rights Coalition, it's education, understanding the problem, but then yes, putting pressure on local officials who are in a position of power to make a decision and to embrace those decisions differently. So I agree 100%. It's all about the system. Systemic racism, systemic classism, these disparate paths, and you have to look and say, well, how did the path to housing wealth become single-family home ownership? Where did that come from, right? That's mostly a post-war asset. That is something that was created mid-20th century, and we've evolved that way, which is how you end up with towns that have these really disproportionate concentrations of wealth. So it's not the person, it is the system. So then you have to say, well, where is that being created? And yes, it is amazing how many important decisions get made at the Zoning Board of Appeals or at the Select Board. It sounds so unglamorous, and I sit through a lot of those meetings, and they are kind of boring. But at some point in the middle there, someone takes a vote to allow something, to permit something, to make that zoning bylaw change, and this is where municipal action is really important. So we as a coalition are really encouraging people to pay attention to what's going on within our government and to show up. And when they ask for public comment on a bylaw change, well, we want to get people there to say, we support this bylaw change because it will allow for multifamily housing closer to the train stop. This is where too the state is really helpful. So part of this is the education piece. As the state last year gave us a few really good tools in terms of some of those zoning changes. One of them was a provision within the Housing Choice Bill that became part of the Economic Development Bill that said you no longer need a supermajority at town meeting to change your zoning. So I don't know how many of you are from Hamilton, but a few years ago there was a cottage zoning bylaw change that was proposed. Who remembers the cottage zoning controversy in Hamilton? It was a proposal that would have allowed for slightly denser cottage-style housing. And that would have created a real opportunity. It got all the way to town meeting. It made it through the machine to the crucial moment. And then at Hamilton town meeting, it passed, but not the supermajority. So a majority of people wanted it, but not the 60%. So one of the things the state changed, it says, well, that's sort of pejorative to people who are trying to do upzoning. So that's a tool that we can leverage. Another provision is the by right zoning change close to municipal transit. So again, when these proposals are there, we need to get people to show up at the meeting to say, we support this. That's something a local advocacy group is going to be really good at, and that's one of the things we're trying to put focus on. Another thing that we're sort of looking out for are ways where issues converge, and housing is a good one, because housing affects school funding, and everyone here knows that, full disclosure, I'm on the Hamilton Wenham School Committee. I care a lot about school funding, so you're sort of looking at housing, enrollment, funding, your tax bill, your mill rate, all of that goes together. And then especially here for people that are mindful of climate, how can housing advocates work with climate advocates? What can we do to build denser housing that has a lesser footprint, that has wastewater patches, that has solar panels, that is closer to transit? Because if we're going to be serious about solving another human rights issue, which is the degradation of the planet and lack of clean water and clean air, we should talk about the propensity in this country to build single-family houses that have to be 2 acres away from each other, where everyone has to have a car, where everyone has to have, duplicate appliances and washers and dryers, and you start to put all that together. So housing is driving part of the climate crisis. And I think that as an advocacy group, we should look to partner with other groups that care about things. Those are two things. And then the last one is, to really hold elected officials accountable for the decisions that they're making and the effect it's having on our community. And again, as Rachel was saying, you have to acknowledge the systemic nature of these issues. And they weren't accidental. One book that I think everyone should read is The Color of Law. Has anyone here read that book? Yeah? It sort of looks back at federal policy and says, how did wealthy America become white America? How did you get towns all across the North Shore where wealth is disproportionately segregated by race and class? And it's not about the person, it's about the system, and it happened on purpose. So in order to correct that, you have to again look at the system and look for those pathways. So at this moment, the people that are making those decisions are our local officials, our state officials, our federal officials, and looking at people making the policy to say, how can we correct this imbalance that has been baked into the fabric of our policy, and then therefore, I would argue, into the psychology of the people themselves, where we have a bias against something coming into us because it seems different, it's all we've ever known. So I'm all about systemic change, and as an advocacy group locally, get involved, figure out who's running for office, show up at public meeting. I know it's torture, trust me, I'm there with you. But wait for the comment period, be respectful of the officials, but let them know that you're paying attention and that you want change in the community.
I see the challenge of going third. So I'm going to echo some of what was said, but I think particularly on the local zoning piece, there's a lot that can get done because those decisions are made locally, community by community. You can advocate for accessory dwelling units, which means that somebody could put in an in-law apartment in the great big home that they no longer need to keep for themselves, but would like to include in there. You can advocate for multi-family housing to be allowed by right in the town. I mean, there's some changes that we can make. Let's get that cottage housing bylaw back up there. Let's get that approved. There are some things that we really need to do. And some of those begin with conversations with those we know and love. So I'm going to out my husband for a moment. He and I were walking through downtown Ipswich the other day, and there's a proposal to remove a car wash and put in 16 units, 16 townhouses, market rate housing. And my husband said, that's terrible. It's too dense. Ipswich doesn't need that kind of density. And I said, it's 2 blocks from the train station. When you think about downtown Newburyport, do you go, oh no, that's too dense? Or do you go, wow, that's kind of nice the way that it's so walkable and the people there can walk to the restaurants and the shops. And he started thinking about it and said, I've never thought about it that way. Now this is the husband of someone who works for an affordable housing agency who's opposed to market rate housing, not even affordable housing in our neighborhood. And it begins with those kind of conversations to say, density is not a bad thing. It can create some wonderful, walkable communities with less congestion and better livability for all of us. So advocate to those you know, go to those public meetings. Please go to a public meeting and support affordable housing. Believe me, the NIMBY neighbors are going to be there. We need you to turn up and say, yes, our community needs this housing. So step forward and do some of that work. The other piece is the funding piece of it. So speaking just for Habitat on this one, it costs us on average about $300,000 now to build a new home. We turn around and we sell those homes for about $200,000. Now, I'm sure you're all sitting there going, that's quite a business model you have there. You lose $100,000 on every home. It's amazing that there's not more people in that line of work, right? But we rely on the generosity of the community to make that happen. So step up, write a check,
step up, get involved, volunteer. We rely on volunteer labor. Shop at the Restore, donate your refrigerator to the Restore. And I don't care if it's Habitat or if it's Family Promise or if it's another agency that you believe strongly in, but put some muscle behind your attendance here this evening. Showing up is part of it. Now we need you to take some action to bring that to reality.
Can I say something else while we're on the topic of zoning and density? Two of my favorite things. You touched on something kind of important too, that here is a very common refrain why we don't want to build housing, and it's the green space argument. Oh, we have this beautiful, we moved here because we wanted green space, and you're going to destroy all of this beautiful native land, and it's going to ruin everything. And one of the best arguments against that is when you have denser housing closer to transit, it protects that green space, right? If people are talking about putting a huge building in an open space that previously was not developed, yeah, that could be problematic, but it can also be made to work. But if you're talking about density in transit, or looking to use properties that were developed that already have a footprint, and one of the things that's come up in conversation here is the revenue, right? Raise your hand if you think your taxes are too high in Hamilton or London, right? Major problems. But looking to say, well, how can we create revenue to help the tax base and do it in a way that's not going to destroy the open space, which, believe me, as someone who supported housing, the number of people who've said, well, you want to build like a skyscraper in the middle of apples and farms. Nothing could be further from the truth. But the problem is we do need more housing, and we need to put it in a place that's sustainable to build that. So the best way to say protect the open spaces, look for the pockets of lands that are developable. Don't resist all development. Be smart about it and recognize there are some buildings that could be reused. And in this community, some of the biggest, developed places are the schools, our town properties, our old estates, or other pockets of town. And the reality is downtown Hamilton and Wenham are not particularly dense. They're not open bucolic fields, but they're not wall-to-wall developed. Or what you have is maybe, first or second floor businesses. What if you went from 1 or 2 stories to 3 or 4 stories? That's not changing the entire character of the town, but it's going to add a lot of housing, a lot of revenue in a place that's already been developed. And I think that for me is the best argument to say, we love your green space, but we're not talking about destroying open farms. Nobody's going to want to do that.
Can I also follow up?
Sorry, we're breaking the rules now.
Because what Anna's bringing up, I think there's another part of this as well. There's a million reasons people oppose all sorts of housing. And one of the things that I often get really confused about is when it seems like people are opposing housing for the right reasons. And I always find that really troubling, because I think all housing is good housing, right? And I agree that there's tons of reasons to build closer to public transit, but sometimes what you'll hear is when it's being built further out from public transit, people will say, well, we shouldn't build there because nobody will be able to get to it, and how, they're gonna need cars to live there. But what that is it's kind of a red herring, or it's a fallacy, because what happens when you build things is other things grow, right? And that's what's happened in almost every area, is when people start to live in an area, that's when the stores start to go there. And that's when all of a sudden, a community is built and people don't have to travel 5 miles to go buy groceries, right? Not to say that many of you want a Stop and Shop in your backyard, but a lot of times what will happen is people will say, oh, well, we don't want them to build here, it's too rural, and what about all those people? What are they gonna do? How are they gonna get anywhere? And it makes it sound like the people opposing this housing have the best interests of those who are about to live there in mind, but what's really happening is they're not giving the opportunity for those developers or for basically anyone that's kind of going into that community to help build that community up and to provide those things. The reason that poverty and lower income families are living in cities, which are astronomically more expensive, quite frankly, is because there's nowhere else for them to go, because the communities like ours that are so spaced out, it is hard to live in them. But the idea that if you can't build the housing because if you build it, then they'll be stuck there, that's just not true. When you build the housing, things grow and expand in those areas. And what we really want to do is capitalize on some of these areas that have lots of space. So this is basically just in addition to denser housing, when you spread out your housing, other things will kind of come to that area and it'll benefit everyone. Housing and more people and diversity in these communities, it benefits everyone. So I also just want to caution you guys that sometimes the arguments may seem sound, but really question where it's coming from and why people are opposing any housing.
And I have to say this because sorry, Judy, I'm so sorry, but you just said something really powerful that speaks to one of the classist biases against housing. You have to build affordable housing downtown because those people don't have cars. It is a profoundly classist statement and it is not substantiated by income or reality. The area median income for where we live is part of the Boston, Quincy, Cambridge area. So we're looped into this HUD guideline and the current AMI for this area, if you are a family of four, and you qualify, I'll use Hamilton as a perfect example because there is a current housing opportunity in downtown Hamilton at 80% of the AMI. If you are a family of four and one person is working, you could qualify for affordable housing in Hamilton and make over $100,000 a year. The idea that people who need affordable housing are destitute and have no cars is a classist red herring that is thrown out to be pejorative to say, well, we can't have that here. You have to resist it at every moment. And just since you mentioned it, those income limits are powerful things. And again, the number of people who qualify for affordable housing will be alarming and eye-opening if you actually look at what the income is. And they don't have cars. They do. That red herring has to go away.
Just to be fair, Megan, do you have anything else to say?
I'd love to hear some questions if there are any.
If you have a question, raise your hand. Yes, stand and ask your question.
So both Hamilton and Wenham are going into master planning processes. Wenham has not had a new master plan since the 1960s. And it's a real opportunity for us to think about housing strategically. What would you suggest we look at in that process?
You want to ask anyone on the panel or sir? This is possible.
So I'm not sure where your housing production plans are, but every community in the region has created one, and many of them have put them on a shelf somewhere. So I would start with that work that's already been done for your community, and then
Hamilton happened a year and a half ago.
Okay, so that would be a good starting place for you, and looking really at the whole town and what the needs are, and then really defining from what the needs are. And my guess will be what you'll find is there are needs at every level.
Go ahead, Rick.
I can feel a little bit more in on the process there. Yeah, Wenham does have an affordable housing development plan. They did act on it, and one of the actions was to build a House Street unit with Habitat. There is a long-term planning and master planning committee not set up. The master planning group of town under the, what is it called? Help me. I decided not to create a separate steering committee to help drive the process. They're going to drive it themselves, which is going to be 5 people. So you need to lobby them. You have 2 committees that you want to stay totally involved with. It's what I call the Community Protection Act. In Wenham, it's a 3% tax on your taxes that goes into a fund that then can be used for 3 things. One of them is green space, open space. One of them is preserving the community's culture.
Historic preservation.
And the third thing is affordable housing.
And recreation.
And excuse me?
Recreation.
Recreation. The affordable housing piece then goes over to the Affordable Housing Trust in Wenham. So you need to stay on top of them because they're the ones that have the plan and get the money and build the housing. And let's just say the housing that gets built is very safe housing generally. And I think that needs to change by getting more people to speak up and say, no, I want family housing. The excuse is, I heard while I was on that committee, is they'll drive up your taxes because they don't pay taxes and they're going to have kids. Well, that to me is right? We don't, right, but we got to share the responsibility. Sorry, it's a big topic for me. I just want to let you know where Wenham is on that.
Well, listening to what you just said, I'm going back to what all you said one way or another, which is educate, educate, educate. And the more, I think that the shocking thing happened to me is that there was, a few years ago, there was a panel, and I found that my daughter is eligible for affordable housing, and I never thought she was going to be, when she's working full-time, it's hard. So that's the thing that is eye-opening. So anyway, anyone else have a question? Go ahead.
You mentioned something about it, Ipswich, that there's market rate housing being built more densely. How do we get away from market rate housing so that we're building that density with the nonprofit builders as opposed to 40Bs even? Because then what they're doing is they're saying, let's overcome the zoning laws for their own profit, even though they're keeping the profits lower, but it's still, it's not necessarily helping the community in that way either.
So, first, this may be a surprise to you, but I'm a favor of market rate housing as well, because I believe a big part of the challenge is simply the supply side, whether it's market rate or big A affordable, as we call it, or small A affordable. I think we need more housing production. So I'm in favor of the 16 units market rate that are proposed. But how do we make sure that more affordable housing gets produced? I think inclusionary zoning bylaws are a big piece of that. So what that means is communities can require that for every 6 units of market rate, every 8 units, each community sets it up differently, but that there be a certain percent of affordable rate units produced. And some communities have it set up so that instead of actually producing those units, that the funds can be given to the local affordable housing trust. That's another way to do it, so that, let's say those 16 units market rate get produced, they don't produce any affordable units on site, they make a $300,000 contribution to the local affordable housing trust. Then the local affordable housing trust comes to Habitat and says, hey, we'd like to help you build 3 homes in Ipswich, for example. So there are ways that can be set up to do that. Does that help answer your question? Okay.
Well, and what I would offer on that, just for context, I'm not sure about when Hamilton already has an inclusionary bylaw that has been used quite effectively to help fund a number of projects, and it is the same thing. You can either build, I think it's 1 unit for every 9 market rate, or you could do a payment in lieu of taxes, which is actually how some of the houses for Habitat were built in Hamilton. I think one of the issues with always paying into the trust, though, is that sometimes the return on the units is higher. So when we're talking about dense housing, multifamily housing, the per unit cost is something to look at. So that's the only sort of issue there. And we talked about housing production plans and looking at the 10% and where each municipality is. I know Wenham is actually much significantly farther ahead than Hamilton. Ipswich is already over 10%. Beverly is over, Wenham is very close to over once Maple Woods get built, but Hamilton is actually less than 3%. We are woefully behind. So sort of looking at those things, and I completely agree that you need market rate housing, you need affordable housing, you need senior housing, family housing, transitional housing, homeless family transitional housing. You need everything because there's a need at every level. But I also think some of it is a net social good because you don't want to sort of repeat these class systems, right? Well, only market rate goes here, and only affordable goes here, and only homeless goes here. You're perpetuating a caste system, which I find personally to be un-American and undemocratic. So I disavow that. So I think when you're looking at the 40Bs, I wouldn't write them off out of hand because they are building more housing. I will confess I don't like the loophole in the law itself that allows even market rate units to count as affordable. That as we're seeing in this market, even an apartment at market rate is still more accessible than buying a home outright. So to me, it goes back to that larger market force. If we can drive down the overall cost of housing, then market rates will become more lowercase affordable, which I like a lot. And then that will also help capital A affordable projects that are going to be able to meet the needs of the community. So I think for me, it all depends on the deal. Like I want to look at that deal and see, and the state again offers interesting incentives. So going back to that AMI level, the higher your AMI, the higher percentage of the units have to be affordable, capitally affordable. If you lower that to 60%, 50%, 30%, going to have fewer percentage of those because you're serving a more at-risk, greater need population. So not all 40Bs are the same. It's really important to look at the overall mix of levels and incomes in those projects.
I just want to add one more thing, which is probably very controversial, and if you both ever speak to me again after this, I will totally understand. I think that one of the flaws in the nonprofit structure and the nonprofit system is the reliance on nonprofits to solve these problems. So what happens sometimes when we think in terms of, well, how do we help places like Habitat and Harbor Light to take these things on? I totally agree. I think Harbor Light, Habitat, Family Promise, we're doing great stuff. But we're doing great stuff because there's breakage in the way that the system works. And nonprofits are a band-aid. We're not the solution, and we shouldn't be the solution, quite frankly. I would love if we all didn't exist entirely in that, because the way that we are left to operate, as Megan was describing, is sometimes impossible. You know, our own staff, most of our staff, I would say, is eligible for affordable housing. That's outrageous. That's not because we're terrible people, it's just because that's the way I'm a terrible person. But it's the way that the system is set up that we have to pinch our pennies to get these things done, to solve these problems that are in existence because of the laws and the policies and everything that's happening in places outside of our control. So I just want to challenge everyone that, like, it's great to kind of put the onus on these nonprofits to do this work because we're really good at it and we're brilliant people and awesome people. But the goal is to make nonprofits obsolete, in my opinion.
Hear, hear? What makes you think I wouldn't want to talk to you with this?
And I think you heard us echoing that. I mean, get involved in whatever way works for you. Get involved with a nonprofit, get involved with local policy, get involved, step in.
But I think we look at you all as the people on the ground, and that's where you know what's going on, and that's how you educate us, and then we need to pick it up and move forward. So, are there any other questions? Yes, go ahead.
I just wonder what the status of the zoning in Hamilton and Wenham with regard to all of the new housing that I'm seeing built is 55 plus. What's up with that?
Well, I mean, I can speak to that a little bit in Hamilton land. So some of it is there is a market, believe it or not, and you know that's a private developer who wants to capitalize. In both cases, there's been a payment into the Affordable Housing Trust to compensate. So the Canterbrook money was put in. I forget the final amount. I want to say it was close to $500,000, and then the new Tobacco Woods proposed development and be something similar developer. So, you know, that's the market at play, right? There are people that would buy those houses and live in those houses, and our inclusionary bylaw has been set up that is permissible. So again, that's why I sometimes think you have to look carefully at the deal and say, well, instead of those luxury 55 and up condos, wouldn't it be great if the town came back and said, yeah, you actually have to build 50% of them as actual affordable housing. That would change that conversation. It wouldn't change the underlying environmental battle that's sort of going on there. But I think part of people's distaste for that particular project is because it's meeting this need, but the need is there. So that's not really a local level. You know, the town can't demand that they build a certain kind of housing or not, per se. And I think it actually speaks to something Rachel was just saying is, wouldn't it be different if the municipalities themselves got a little bit more in the game? Instead of just being the permitting agent, what if they were the landowners? What if the town was the developer? Well, now all of a sudden you could do that. What if we changed the market so that the municipalities or the state was in the driver's seat and wasn't relying on a for-profit developer who's giving a token payout to a nonprofit developer to manage the little bit of it that makes everyone sleep better at night? Wouldn't it be different if the town said, no, we're going to buy that property and we're going to build it this way? And maybe some of it was 55 and up luxury condos, because there are people that want that. But why is it an exclusion of something else? And then again, back to the classism, part of the reason those 55 and up communities always want to pay as opposed to build, because it breaks their marketing plan. If you're marketing luxury senior condos, but 4 of the units are going to have to, because of fair housing law, go to families of lower income, now all of a sudden those people are not going to want to live there. It breaks their plan.
I will say again, I'm going to surprise you.
I think there's some advantage to the 55 plus townhouses being built. What we're seeing is a lot of baby boomers who are empty nesters who would like to downsize from the homes that they raise their families in and don't have any place to go, to be able to stay locally. So if they can downsize to a 55 plus townhome where they have less of maintenance and everything, what that does is it lets a family move into that, what would have been considered a family home. And so we're seeing the baby boomers are sort of stopping the market of the generation X, Y, Gen Y, I don't know, I've lost all the letters. The millennials who want to buy a home are competing with the baby boomers. And so this can be part of the solution there. And the payments to the Affordable Housing Trust, well, the Affordable Housing Trust just helped Habitat spend $400,000 to help Habitat acquire the land to build the homes, the 10 homes that we're going to be able to build in Hamilton. So those payments to the Affordable Housing Trust really can make a difference.
So another question. Mrs. Foley, Mrs. Foley, stand up. Can you stand?
Yeah, sure. I was just fascinated to hear that the sort of the municipalities making decisions really are a core structure because things don't flow easily. Is there a township or governance in America or internationally that you've seen that does work a heck of a lot more smoothly? And I mean, let's start with America.
I will confess, I am not an international housing expert, so that's a deficiency in my knowledge. I think part of it is, I think in some cities you see stronger tenant rights laws. I'm just thinking about my time when I live in Seattle, and from a zoning standpoint, New York City is a good place. It's a little bit more protective. I think bigger municipalities tend to have stronger sort of pro-housing, pro-tenant rules. I'm not immediately familiar with someplace around here that is doing localized development like that.
Well,
Co-ops, I mean, that's another New York-y thing.
I can't necessarily, hopefully you can speak to development, but I can say that there are a few cities. One of the things, for example, that hasn't been brought up because it's a little complicated to explain is called the continuum of care structure in the country. And this is basically HUD has designated geographical areas across the country to be responsible for solving their issues of affordable housing and homelessness. And so the continuums of care are basically every single town across the country is within one of those. And they have other types of housing that they are responsible for kind of distributing. And it gets a little complicated, but there's millions of types of housing and affordable housing. And so this is called like permanent supportive housing, which comes a lot from like HUD. They give money to nonprofits who, everything goes through nonprofit. Again, I'm supportive of nonprofits, don't get me wrong, I run one, but I hope that one day we won't need them. But so the continuums of care are really interesting because they kind of require towns to work together to solve their issues. And what is fascinating in Massachusetts is we had a North Shore continuum of care, which basically was all of the towns in Essex County. And the city of Peabody took on that responsibility. Peabody does a lot to kind of take ownership over their responsibilities within the city to push out affordable housing. And then the city that I came from before Family Promise, Cambridge, did the same thing, where they said, okay, HUD is designating, because the other thing about these continuums is they say, all right, you have to figure it out. And usually what ended up happening is a bunch of nonprofits were like, okay, let's work together, guys. We don't get any extra money for this, but we'll figure out how to solve these problems. So that meant that they were working and implementing like different HUD laws and all of these things. And it was like extra work basically for these nonprofits. So every so often, the city stepped up and said, we're going to be the COC lead. We're going to take this on ourselves. And so Cambridge did that. And it was really wonderful because my work in Cambridge, where I was literally housing people and putting people into permanent supportive housing, I was a city employee. I got more money in 2 years for my retirement than I had in all of my time in nonprofits ever. The city had wonderful benefits, it did so much, and what was really phenomenal is that I was doing the work that I love, but I was a city employee. And so I do think there are cities that are really understanding their role in this. I don't know enough to know if Cambridge was developing their own housing or whatnot, but they were definitely doing a ton on a municipal level to preserve the housing that they had, to make sure that people got to stay there if they lived there. They worked really closely with the Cambridge Housing Authority. They started, where I worked, it was called the Multi-Service Center, and they created an entire building where they let nonprofits have a satellite office where people experiencing homelessness could walk in and access all of these things. And the city took that on. They created a budget for this. So I definitely think there are cities that are doing it the right way. Obviously, Cambridge has quite a bit more of a reason to prioritize this work because I'm sure they are dealing with their own things. I'm pretty sure apartments in Cambridge are like 10 times worse than even out here. But I do think there are models that exist where cities have kind of stepped up and said it's our responsibility to get this done.
Well, one of the ones you're talking about, now I think about it, it's anything, again, I don't know exhaustively, but in the city of Beverly, there is a major project going on with Hartwood, which is my employer as well, at Briscoe Middle School. And that's a joint venture that there's a for-profit developer that does a lot of great work. There's a nonprofit developer. It's a former municipal building. So I think that is happening, but as Rachel is saying, it's interesting that a lot of it is the state provides the money. You know, Secretary Keneally was there and awarded this massive grant, like state money flowing through a property, but there's still sort of this conduit through the nonprofit arms to manage it and figure it out. So I do think there's a lot of money coming, and there's a lot more federal money coming with ARPA funds and Recovery Act funds. I mean, the housing market is about to get flooded with cash. So I think it'll be interesting to see how municipalities do or do not apply for those funds. And one of the things too that I forgot to say, or hasn't mentioned in terms of the grants, if this municipality actually changes the zoning and makes itself eligible through by right dezoning near transit, that will make them eligible for certain state grants. But if they do not, guess what? They won't be eligible. So I think it's really interesting too to see this little dance between federal money flowing to DHCD, which then outflows it to the nonprofit world, but the nonprofits sometimes need a for-profit partner. And then, of course, you have adaptive reuse of these big municipal buildings. So it's
DHCD is Department of Housing and Community Development, which is the state agency that runs all this.
right.
Okay, I'm gonna jump in here and see if there's any other questions. If you haven't asked a question before, is there anybody who has a question that hasn't asked one before?
I'd like to make some comments eventually.
You can probably stay a little later, right? You can make a comment.
I got a few.
Oh, well, okay, let's do this. Let's save that for afterwards, and maybe if you could stay for a few minutes.
I'll talk about housing all night long.
Because I'm noticing we're moving past our time, and I've lost track of Cecilia, so. I have one. What's that?
We're actually right on time.
We're right on time, good. I have one question to ask you, a big question. If okay, this is the one about, in a sentence. You have to hear that again. In a sentence, what's the one key thing that you personally, from your position, your perspective, would like the audience to take away from our discussion? And I think
After
first, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So everyone who knows me knows brevity is not my strong suit.
I get it.
Not my strong suit. But you're right. That was my pre-sentence. I was actually such a dork. I wrote it out, and it is actually one sentence.
It's a long sentence.
Well, minutia. My one sentence instruction to this crowd: reframe seeing people who need housing not as an economic burden that weighs you down and diminishes the legacy of the past, but rather as a future gift of humanity that makes your community stronger and more diverse.
Step up, get involved, decide what it is that you're going to do, and do it.
I would say listen, learn, and then share the stories that you hear, and then go out and vote. Learn and then use what you learned to vote.
Very nice, thank you. I think we have a musical selection, and are we all singing? No. No, okay.
are weeping. When you laugh, I'll laugh with you. I will share your joy and sorrow till we've seen this journey through. Won't you let me be your servant? Let me be as Christ to you. Pray that I may have the grace to let me be my servant too.
I want to thank everyone for coming. I want to thank Jen and Rachel and Anna for being here. And there was a lot talked about. We could spend probably another several hours.
Okay, go for a couple hours.
So I was trying to stay true to the outline of
Yes,
time.
thank you.
And I surprisingly came in right on time at 8:25. So if you're willing to stay, maybe 5 or 10 minutes if people want to stay and have a conversation, but let's let them go by 8:40.
I'm happy to take any questions or comments now as you come up. And if anybody wants to volunteer for Habitat, I'm also happy to take your names and phone numbers and start a list.
Ooh, that's the risk you take coming and asking a question. But thank you all for coming. I appreciate it being here.